Hello! Today we'll be talking about a map. Which map? Well, the one and only Freedom Burger Institute's Same Map as Always map. Jokes aside, it's the so-called Economic Freedom Map, which is meant to visually represent the level of economic freedom experienced across different countries. How fun! They must definitely have a valid approach to data and methodology then, right? Of course not. It's free market garbage from the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation. These are the organizations that publish the data the map is based on, and both are rabid free market conservative quote-unquote think tanks that publish loads of neoliberal nonsense for the purpose of influencing economic policy in the US and abroad. The Economic Freedom of the World, published by the Fraser Institute, and the Index of Economic Freedom by the Heritage Foundation are basically the same thing roughly, so for time and simplicity I'm going to critique them together. Why are we talking about them exactly? Well, it's not uncommon to mention a particular fault of capitalism, only to be met with a tired rebuff in the form of, oh, well, the countries practicing all the capitalism are doing so well. Clearly the issue is that Bangladesh isn't capitalist enough, or any other country example. They'll claim that the issue is not too much capitalism, but in fact too little, and use this map to illustrate that. Not enough free markets, too much state intervention, too many safety nets or subsidies, the list goes on and on. Before we delve further, let's examine where these fantastic and impartial organizations that make these indices get their funding, since they exert such a heavy hand over American policy. Joseph Coors, yes, that Coors, I had no idea, was an early supporter and instrumental in the Heritage Foundation's formation and growth, with significant donations in 1972 and 1980, with additional undisclosed support throughout his life. So-called charitable foundations, such as the Sarah Scaife Foundation, provided over $15 million from 2002 to 2014, while another of these glorified tax havens, the Braidley Foundation, contributed over $3.5 million between 2002 and 2014. The Charles Koch Foundation likewise makes an appearance, contributing hundreds of thousands of dollars to both the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute. I'm sure their donation to these particular think tanks has nothing to do with their interests and political positions. So-called charitable organizations, such as the climate change-denying Aurea Foundation, got in on this too, donating over $1.6 million since 2006. Corporate donations likewise show up, with ExxonMobil contributing $50,000 in 2012 to support the Heritage Foundation's advocacy for deregulation of oil and gas companies, and $120,000 to the Fraser Institute for anti-climate change programs during 2003. Remember that these are direct corporate donations and don't include donations from industry magnates such as Joseph Coors or Peter Monk, the latter being the founder of the Aurea Foundation mentioned earlier, who owes his wealth to owning a lucrative gold mining company and peddling anti-climate change nonsense. One of the primary criticisms economists have of both indices is their narrow and biased definitions of economic freedom. It's easy to assume that these indices would highlight countries where people have greater control over their economic lives and the institutions that govern them. These indices don't do that. Instead, they focus on corporate and so-called entrepreneurial freedom, often ignoring social and political freedoms, which are major factors in quality of life, unsurprisingly. The Fraser Institute, Heritage Foundation, and other right-wing think tanks equate economic freedom with minimal government intervention, low taxes, deregulation, the usual. These policies are better known as neoliberalism, a topic which I've covered in another video here. This approach ignores what are clearly better measures of economic freedom, such as healthcare outcomes, literacy and access to schooling, social welfare and labor rights, and other factors which are necessary for a complete and solid understanding of a country's economic health. Also, TLDR, but neoliberalism is bad as a means to increase profits for the narrow sliver of people at the expense of the rest of the population. Watch the video. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a highly detailed game in which you can command a massive naval fleet featuring some of history's most iconic war vessels in an exciting and dynamic world. Recreate historic battles, experience game-altering weather effects that make each battle unique and require changes to the tactics you use, and immerse yourself in the journey of naval history. With over 40 maps, more than 20 ports to choose from, and hundreds of ships designed based on historical documents and actual blueprints from the first half of the 20th century, each battle will make you feel like you're actually there. With a large active community and a steady flow of new missions, game updates and events weekly, there's always something new to experience. Join clans to compete in competitive game modes and talk with fellow wargamers on the official Discord or the forum. What are you waiting for? Learn exciting naval history and engage in dynamic battles by clicking on my link in the description and using the code DDAY80th, all caps. With the 80th anniversary of D-Day happening this June, join the battle as we commemorate the heroes of D-Day in World of Warships with a special 80th anniversary event. Engage in epic naval warfare as you relive one of history's most pivotal moments on the seas. Command new legendary vessels, strategize with your fleet in new missions, and dominate the waves in thrilling battles inspired by the events of June 6, 1944. Participate in exclusive in-game events, unlock commemorative rewards, and by using my link in the description, get 200 doubloons, 7 days premium time, 1 million credits, the choice of the following exciting ships after 15 battles, and 3 special D-Day missions after 9 battles that will only be available for a limited time. Again, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and click the link in the description and get started. Thanks to World of Warships for the sponsorship. This helps me pay my editor fairly, which is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video. The methodology behind these indices raises eyebrows amongst serious economists. The Heritage Foundation's index is built around 10 components, among them being trade policy, fiscal burden, government intervention, and labor market policies. Unsurprisingly, it penalizes countries for implementing laws that protect workers and the environment. For example, the US was marked down for passing Sarbanes-Oxley, a weak law intended to improve corporate accountability by having them maintain basic record keeping. This focus on minimizing government intervention, regardless of the intervention's purpose, ignores the many ways in which regulation actually helps businesses and their products, which is less important than helping people and the environment, of course. It also ignores how it's only government interference if it negatively affects businesses. US imperial foreign policy abroad for cheaper raw materials isn't considered government interference. The Fraser Institute's index relies heavily on subjective assessments and data that can be easily manipulated to fit a particular narrative. And let's be honest, they're doing exactly that. The index uses change in government spending rather than actual spending levels to assess fiscal burden, leading to absurd conclusions. For example, Sweden and Denmark, despite their extensive welfare states, are rated as having a lower fiscal burden than the US. Both indices only look at top income and corporate tax rates, ignoring effective tax rates and other forms of taxation, which ends up misrepresenting the actual tax burden faced by citizens and, to a lesser extent, businesses. Speaking of misinformation, the indices' flawed approach caused them to make ridiculous factual inaccuracies. One especially egregious example was the incorrect reporting of Denmark's top income tax rate as 26.5% instead of the actual 54%. Further silly distortions when it comes to industrial policy or informal markets makes the indices ranking terrible tools for guiding any regulation. They fail to account for the positive role of industrial policies in stereotypically hyper-capitalist countries like Taiwan or South Korea, where government intervention has been the reason for significant economic growth. Instead, these indices penalize countries with large informal sectors, suggesting that these countries are less free due to government restrictions and which in turn is driving some activities underground. This unfairly biases the indices against developing countries, which often have significant informal economies not based on so-called illicit or harmful substances, meaning they're selling flip-flops, not drugs. While these criticisms do a decent job driving the point home that these indices are terrible at what they claim to do, another glaring issue with them is the weak correlation between these indices and economic growth. For example, fast-growing economies like China and Vietnam rank low despite their impressive growth rates. Conversely, some of the top-ranked countries like Estonia experience relatively slow economic growth. I mentioned in passing earlier that these institutions are big on neoliberal policies, so it probably won't surprise you that this ideological bias is very palpable in these indices and is their biggest flaw. They promote a very specific set of policies such as low taxes, deregulation, minimal government intervention, all under the guise of so-called economic freedom. This bias is evident in how they weigh different components in their model and their emphasis on specific economic outcomes. As an example, the exaggerated fear of moderate inflation and their emphasis on 0% inflation as an ideal are not supported by empirical evidence, but then again, neither is most of what neoliberal fanatics think. Okay, so the map and its underlying data are bad, less than useless, and/or actively harmful. I think that's pretty clear now. What should we use instead in that case? There are quite a few, unsurprisingly. The Human Development Index, the Global Peace Index, the World Happiness Report, the Global Competitiveness Index, the Social Progress Index, the Legatum Prosperity Index, the Ligma Prosperity Index, it's stupid, the Environmental Performance Index, amongst others. Taken together, these indices prove everything I and other leftists have been saying for years. These organizations that publish these reports tend to be very pro-maintaining the status quo, and even they can't make it look good, or even okay. Global North nations such as Norway, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Australia, and Canada consistently rank at the top of these indices. This is due in large part to their relatively more robust institutions, quote unquote. There's a reason for that, but we'll get there soon. Social safety nets, also a reason for that. high standard of living, see the previous note, and environmental policies of dumping their waste in the third world, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On the other hand, the bottom rankings are often populated by countries from the global south, including Congo, Chad, Afghanistan, you get the gist. Let me paint you a picture. Country A colonizes Country B. Country A enslaves or indentures the local population, exploits their natural resources, squashes attempts at independence, and extracts massive profits in the meanwhile, which subsidize the quality of life in Country A. Eventually, Country B manages to become independent only to find itself in a global economic system created by Country A and countries like Country A. Country B is forced to pay back colonial taxes in return for their independence, is forced to take out loans from Country A which it has to pay back at extortionate interest rates, as well as having its politics still manipulated by Country A and its ilk. Country B will never truly become independent at this rate, all for the profit and benefit of Country A. If this sounds like a ridiculous example, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but this is the case of Haiti and France, and practically all the rest of the imperial periphery. The point of debt cannot be understated. Remember how we mentioned that these indices are in support of free market policies? Well, what kind of policies do you think are recommended to impoverished, or better yet, overexploited nations from the IMF and World Bank? Free market policies, in return for much needed loans. Sell state assets, privatize everything under the sun, including railroads, healthcare, basic sanitation facilities, etc. Remove subsidies, sell off all that's worth anything to wealthy foreign conglomerates, the usual list. The selling off of state assets then prevents these countries of ever really paying off their debts, since all the profitable sectors and resources are not owned by said country anymore. The ideological game crumbles right then and there. The policies these indices support, the same policies that supposedly have resulted in the prosperity of the global north, are the very same policies that further impoverish the global south and maintain them in the same debt trap. It's a game they know is bullshit, but they maintain because the true purpose isn't to quote-unquote raise developing countries out of poverty, but to keep those same countries' natural resources and labor cheap and ripe for exploitation. It's colonialism in a new dress. This of course also overlooks how for many global north countries, for a very long time, free market policies were explicitly avoided by design because they are antithetical to the development of wealth and economic independence of a new economy, particularly in the industrial sense. Protectionism created the wealthy countries, now forcing free market policies on so-called developing nations. Ha Junchang's Kicking Away the Ladder is the greatest intro book on the topic in my opinion. A closer look at these rankings reveals some interesting patterns as well. If you quickly consider who the US's most important allies and most threatening adversaries are, quote-unquote, the list starts to look a little, let's say, strange. The most obvious thing anyone can notice is that many of these top-performing countries are US allies, enjoying robust relationships with the United States, economic cooperation, defense agreements, and shared so-called liberal values, which aren't worth the paper they're written on, see the current Palestine events. For instance, Norway ranks highly in environmental performance with strong policies on renewable energy and conservation, yet it's also a significant producer of oil and gas, contributing to global carbon emissions. Denmark, Finland, and Switzerland excel in environmental sustainability, investing heavily in wind energy and green technologies, but likewise benefit from global supply chains that involve extremely exploitative practices in the global south, such as cobalt mining, huge amounts of CO2 emissions, human rights violations, the list goes on and on. The second most obvious observation is that countries consistently at the bottom of these indices, like Venezuela, Syria, Sudan, Afghanistan, are considered US adversaries and or are located in areas of the globe made unstable for geopolitical ends, usually by the US or some other global north country. For instance, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is rich in minerals essential for electronics such as cobalt. These resources aren't owned by the Congolese people, but instead foreign, usually global north conglomerates. These resources are extracted and processed under extremely harsh conditions, often involving child labor, slave labor, and other unpleasantries. The profit of these ventures flows to the global north, leaving the local communities unindustrialized, impoverished, their environment destroyed, and their health severely compromised. Now, who was it that overthrew Lumumba again? Sudan's oil wealth has also been a focal point of exploitation, where oil companies have raked in huge profits by taking advantage of the series of ongoing conflicts fed by American and other foreign policy interests. Venezuela, which has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, suffers from economic turmoil and environmental degradation due in large part to the US and other global north US allies refusing to recognize Venezuela's right to owning its own resources. Even prior, the Venezuelan oil industry, mismanaged and exploited by international interests, has led to oil spills, deforestation, and significant pollution. The narrative is similar in Nigeria, where the Niger Delta has been severely impacted by oil extraction activities of companies such as Shell and Chevron. The resultant oil spills and gas flaring have destroyed the livelihoods of local farmers and fishermen, causing long-term health problems and environmental damage. All of this exploitation, environmental damage, and disregard for the lives of the people producing most of the world's wealth is on a scale never before seen. I made a proper video on this here, but a rough overview. For example, the value of minerals extracted from African countries and used in the global electronics industry runs in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. In 2017 alone, $203 billion was taken from Africa, either directly through corporations repatriating profits or by illegally moving money out of the continent. That's just Africa, though. The global north appropriated $2.2 trillion from the south in 2015, and over the period from 1960 to 2018, the drain from the south totaled $62 trillion, or $152 trillion when accounting for lost growth. The human mind is not capable of fully comprehending the enormous size of these numbers, but it's safe to say that the global south is rich, very rich, as colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism doesn't go to poor countries. Cue the old Parenti adage.
These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
To add insult to injury, the top 10% of global carbon emitters generate almost half of all greenhouse gas emissions, the consequences of which are most devastatingly felt by the people of the global south who are not equipped to sufficiently deal with those issues in addition to the regular business of staying alive day to day. Okay, so after looking at all this data and analysis, what can we say? The TLDR version is that while countries in the global north generally perform well in indices measuring quality of life, economic stability, and environmental sustainability, they are also complicit in global environmental degradation and exploitation, but they just happen to offset it onto the global south. It is the global south that maintains all that quality of life and economic stability, while the global north greenwashes the rest away. The reason the global north performs well on these indices is because of the systematic impoverishment, which again subsidizes the so-called good performance of the imperial core. The sheer scale of wealth transfer should be considered one of the worst crimes in human history, given the incalculable suffering it's caused thus far. A better system is possible. What is sorely missing from all these fancy indices is this type of analysis which investigates the cause of all the things these indices find on the ground. Without that analysis, these indices are nothing but a flurry of data with little impact used to justify either neoliberal policy or the salaries of people working for NGOs in the global north. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kudrow. Thanks for watching.